Welcome to episode 35 of the Future of Work show. If you've been following us for a while, you know that we talk about ideas that are going to help us navigate our future in a very fast changing world. And this is also what we work in. So, Papia Banerjee and I at Uncube, we act as educators and advisors on topics around the future of work, helping leadership teams make sense of a very fast changing future and the major trends that they need to be aware of. But for the last month or so, we've stayed away from our regular topics around technology and technology's impact and how that's going to make sense for organizations' culture, design, leadership, etc. And we've in fact been focused on topics very specific to where we're at in India, the COVID second wave. Our last conversation was with spiritual teacher Nitya Shanti on the same subject, finding calm in anxious times. It was an extremely popular conversation. I think it was viewed more than 4,000 times. So we had a lot of people write in saying how useful they found some of those suggestions. Now, today's conversation carries the same topic ahead, but from two very, very different perspectives. And I have with me two extremely distinguished guests whom I'm just going to bring on. Dr. Ashish Ambastha and Dr. Alok Sarin. Now, Dr. Alok Sarin is an MD from All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and he's now a senior consultant at Sitaram Bhartiya Institute. He's also a scholar, a researcher, a writer for even popular magazines and newspapers around mental health, particularly during COVID times. Dr. Ashish Ambastha is a PhD in the science of happiness and positive psychology from University of Mumbai. And he's also the founder of Happy Plus, which is a tech-based platform for organizations and people working in organizations to develop happiness habits. So we have two very, very interesting perspectives coming together as well to understand how all of us can navigate very, very anxious times like the ones that we're living in today. So thank you, Alok, and thank you, Ashish, for joining me today.
Thank you, Dr. Shalini.
Wonderful. Alok, I'm going to start off with you, actually. I have been wondering, and I know that we've sort of met in passing and spoken a little bit about how we're living in such anxious times. I've also seen you speak about it in many of your newspaper articles, that anxiety is the new normal. So would you share a little bit about what that means? What does it mean for anxiety to be the new normal? And what's the impact of this anxiety, which is all around us, on us, maybe impacts that we aren't ourselves always familiar with as well?
Sure. So we are living through interesting times, really interesting times. In geometry, there's this concept of what is called an inflection point, which is that when there is a curve, a graph being drawn, at some points when the curvature, the concavity of it changes, then there is a potential for this to go in many, many different directions. Lest it seem like sailing under false colors, my understanding of geometry or calculus is actually very, very, very rudimentary. But I see this present time as that sort of a potential time, in the sense that an inflection point doesn't necessarily have to be a turning point. It may or may not be a turning point. So coming back to what it is that we are experiencing at the moment, we've been under lockdown pretty much long times. In 2020, we've been under lockdown for many weeks now. But there is a difference. there is a difference between what was happening last year and there is a difference between what is happening now. And what is happening now, as a journalist, not one, but many journalists, many people, pretty much everybody that we see talks about, which is that you wake up in the morning with a sense of dread, with a sense of foreboding. What is it that we are going to be, seeing today? What is it that
Understood.
I will experience in this day? Many of us are fortunate in the sense that immediate family is safe. This, however, doesn't mean that we are untouched by it. Many of us have had family members who have been unwell. I know that this is true, Shalini, of you. And I know how difficult it has been in the last few weeks, which is why it is even more impressive that these shows have been going on despite the havoc wreaked by this. All of us have experienced family, friends, co-workers, neighbors. It's nobody is left untouched by this anxiety. And there's been an enormous amount of writing. There's been an enormous amount of talk about this. The fact that this is a pandemic. It's a viral pandemic. There are shadow pandemics. There's a pandemic of emotional distress. The fact that apart from the pandemic of emotional distress, of the impact, the shadow pandemic of the impact on the economy, the viral pandemic, of course, the fact that it is a crisis of justice, of equity. In a sense, it's a crisis of humanity. And it has actually taken a pandemic to remind us of these things which we normally don't, think about too much. Or if we do, perhaps all that we do is to pay lip service to them. Even last year when all of us were watching with horrified amazement how hundreds and thousands of migrants walked across the length and breadth of this country, completely unsupported. There was a sense of other, that we're okay. It's somebody else who is, going through this. This wave has divested us of that fig leaf completely. There is no other. We are the other. We are the people who are going through this. It has reminded us, and it has taken a pandemic to remind us of the fact that in a sense, that we are one. We are one in our suffering. We are one in our helplessness. We are one in our experience. The numbers are receding. The hospitals now have empty beds. The difficulty in getting oxygen cylinders and concentrators is not what it was 3 weeks ago. People are not dying in the parking lots of hospitals or shuttling between hospitals. And this is what that inflection point is. Are we now going to retreat into our cocoons, into our positions of privilege, Or are we in some way going to try and think larger? Are we going to try and figure out what it is that this experience has taught us? What this actually means? It's, you know, are we going to start going back and saying, कि ये तो हो गया है, ये तो, the numbers are okay. We have dealt with the second wave. My family is vaccinated. My kids have received, like perhaps most of us, most of our kids, their first doses, and in the next, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, they'll get their second dose. We're okay. And of course, this is terrible what happened. Or are we going to actually raise those hard questions? And that's why it's a potential. It's a potential point where we can all go in different ways. Society can go in different ways. The fact that we have obviously many things to learn from this, the fact that we need to learn those very many things, whether it is consideration for the less fortunate, consideration for the less privileged, whether it is making sure that, ecological insult doesn't happen, making sure that, in what way is it that we work towards understanding what it is that has caused this, why this has transpired. I'm sorry, I can go on and on about this, but I think I'll stop here. I think so it's up to us to figure out what it is that we're going to learn.
I know, Alok, that in an earlier conversation you spoke about how for healing to happen, some sense of collective sense making is going to be really important. So let me ask you, how does one even, how does one do that? Like, what are the forums? What are the formats for collective sense making? And I think you referred to some of this in what you just said as well. That how do we, what are the questions? What is it that we're taking away from this experience? How does one do that?
Sure. So solutions, at least the way that I think of this, solutions will not be unitary. Solutions will not be formulaic. Solutions will not be, bullet points that ये 3 चीजें करनी है और अगर हम करेंगे तो solve हो जाएगा. Solutions have to be larger. Solutions have to be multi-dimensional, multi-specific. So what I spoke about just now was in what is it that we're going to learn. Coming down specifically to what it is that we are experiencing now. And this is as much true of, let me say, I work in a place called Sitaram Bharti. It's a hospital. It's a small hospital. It got converted into, a largely a COVID facility. There was a time when, about 60 of the 72 beds had been converted to COVID. And our physician friends would half seriously, half facetiously tell us that please don't fall sick now, because if you do, we're not sure that we'll be able to get you a bed. But seriously, what the physicians went through, the people who have over, 4 weeks seen scores of deaths, the people who've had to decide whom to admit and whom not to admit, the people who had to decide whom to shift to the ICU, whom to give oxygen to, at times when the oxygen is running out. We know people who have struggled, who've been literally begging others, hospitals, friends, known to as we our particular Indianism is uh, asking for beds and failing. How is it that we are going to come to terms with this? The stories are endless. There's a friend of mine whose brother died uh, after a struggle with you know, getting a hospital bed. There are numerous friends who've not been able to get beds. None of us, whether we were that individual, whether we were that family member, or whether we are witnesses, are untouched by this. The doctor who is witnessing this, the nurse who's seeing this day in and day out, the journalist who's reporting this, seeing scenes which in in a in a good world no human being should have to witness. The the trauma that they are going through, the griefs that they are going through. How are we even going to begin to make sense of this? And remember that the way that society makes sense of grief is societal. That's what society is. We gather around, we tell our stories, we listen to those stories, we share those stories. There was this, we read in the papers about these two young boys, 21 or 22-year-old boys, who had these really wonderful names, Ralfred and Joffred Raphael. Two Malayali boys in Meerut. Where in the world will you have, these are names to conjure with. These are Viking chieftains' names. But these are Malayali boys in Meerut. It's only in India that this can happen. And it's only in India that these two young men will die within 24 hours of each other. In a sense, the weapon that we had, and I'm very fond of saying this, so you will forgive me if you've heard this before, but the Divyastra which society has of the societal collective is at the moment not available to us. It's the same stories of mythology कि जब आपको जरूरत पड़ेगी इस अस्त्र की, आपको उस समय आप इस्तेमाल नहीं कर पाओगे. And so now it's cremations on video. There's a doctor in the hospital who was telling me that his mother died of COVID. Getting 4 people to the cremation ground was a challenge. He himself had COVID. He had myalgia. He had fever. There was no way he could not go. There was nobody to help. The buyer. There was nobody to help with the making of the buyer. So it broke. Obviously, inexperienced people doing this for the first time. He may be a very skilled anesthesiologist. He may be excellent at putting in cannulas. Poor fellow, he didn't know how to make the buyer. It broke. The body fell. They built it again. And they cremated her. It is by the telling of these stories, it is by, in a sense, making that individual grief collective. When I grieve for Prashant in my hospital, when I grieve for Ralfred and Joffred in Meerut, when society grieves when we bear witness to their stories, this is what perhaps at one level will help us to come to terms with that grief. It is that meaning making which might happen, which perhaps will help us come to terms with it. But this is only one way. We'll have to figure out, we'll have to talk about this. This is why this is an inflection point. Unless we are going to,
Yeah.
otherwise we are going to retreat. We are going to look at our own, सीताराम भारतीय ठीक है, अब तो 15 बेड खाली है, 15 बेड खाली है कोविड के लिए और आप मरीज नहीं है, so we are okay. But the fact is that we are not okay.
Yeah.
We are not okay.
I think
We
you
are
make a
really
very, very important and a bigger point, and it's not one which is as often discussed. That in order to heal, it's not just an individual process, although I'm sure there is an individual process as well. But healing for something as big as what we've experienced has to happen as a community or people coming together. And that has been really challenging because of the fact that we cannot come together in physical spaces, and therefore all our coming togethers are virtual, like this one. And that in a sense comes in the way of the collective sense making and meaning, which as a society, from what I hear you say, is one of the key steps in us healing as a country or as a society, which is one part probably of an individual's healing journey. So, Ashish, let me ask you, what is your sense? I know that you have worked a lot in the positive psychology space. Your PhD is within that. And within Happy Plus, that's what your organization also focuses. So, in times of extreme anxiety, like the one we're living in, does happiness and happiness habits, do they still play a role, or does one need to wait for this heightened anxiety to sort of settle and us to reach whatever is going to be the next normal? Is that when some of this becomes useful?
Uh, it's a great question. There is so much of anxiety around us, and somebody's talking about happiness. How is it possible? But I will say that it's like when you searching for happiness right now is like going for a marathon when you haven't even ran for 100 meters, right? So it's not something which you require right now, but whether you have practiced it throughout your life or not. So I'm talking about those elements. We have to understand the construct of both clinical psychology and positive psychology, and probably we'll be able to make more sense out of it because of that. So if you look at two-thirds of our neurons in our brains are constantly looking for something negative, because that's how we have survived. Right? We have been outlived all other animals because of this sense making of there is some danger, and you can either fight or flight. So that sense making has ensured that we have lived so far. But although there are no dinosaurs around us, that system is still there. Okay, and that's why we are very prone to move towards negativity, and that's what media does to us, right? If there is a sensational news, you will see a lot of people coming and reacting to it. But if it is a good news, you won't find a lot of takers. Right now, I can see that people are talking about good news and good gestures. But in normal world, there were a lot of experiments done where companies wanted to come out with a newspaper which will only have good news, and it did not survive. But if you turn around today's newspapers, you will find that 90% of the words are negative. So at one hand, you have a software which is tilted towards negativity, and on the other side, you have content which is purely negative in terms of the way it is being consumed. So you can understand the cocktail it is creating inside our mind. And add to this the pandemic which we are going through, where
Ashish, I think you've. Okay, we'll come back to Ashish when Ashish comes back to us. That's an interesting point, Alok. Is it true? I mean, you're an MD from AIM, so tell us, is this true
It,
that, hey, Ashish, are you back? Ah,
I'm
we
sorry.
lost you for a little bit. No worries.
I'm
You were
sorry.
saying, please go ahead.
So I was talking about so you have a situation where your software is built negatively, and you have a lot of content which is coming to you which is negative. So obviously, if you add pandemic to it, the situation becomes very worrisome. Now, when you look at our own body, if we don't brush our teeth for 3 days, I think we will have pain. We will feel little, will not feel good. Just imagine if you don't, brush your mind and bring positivity around it, what can happen? So, the obvious thing is that in the first instance, you can see, sense, and feel. But if you have not worked on your mental aspect, it does not show you immediately. It shows in times like this when you wanted to have resilience, but you don't have. You wanted to have hope, but you don't have. You wanted to have optimism, but you don't have. So my point is, it's not something which can be acquired as when you need basis. It needs to be worked on a daily basis. It needs to be created as an habit, and it needs to be worked around not only individually but as society. As society, we need to be more hopeful. As society, we need to be more having more gratitude, and as society, we need to show more resilience. And that's where I will say that the real change will come. Hopefully, this pandemic will, ensure that we don't chase those things which we feel will give us happiness, but work on those elements which truly makes us feel happier. And one of the elements I will talk about is character building. So if you have got good character, where you can talk about being empathetic, you talk about being helpful, you talk about being resilient, and practice this on a daily basis, you will be in a good shape. And that's why we always talk about building happy habits. Habits are something which you do on a regular basis, and it becomes your second habit. Happiness needs to come to the forefront of our endeavors. Whatever we do, if we are successful there and but you are not happy, that means it was not something worth doing. So I think whatever we should do, we need to bring happiness in the context of our endeavors and ensure that we practice and build habits which helps us deal with times like this, Dr. Shadi.
Okay. So, Ashish, what I'm taking from what you're saying is this, that while, as you're saying, we are in a place which, as you say, is like a marathon when we haven't run 100 yards. So, it isn't about necessarily bringing in happiness habits which will help you for today. But if you have practiced these happiness habits for a period of time, then when you are placed in a situation of great stress and anxiety, like the one we are experiencing, they help you tide that over. Is that my understanding correct of what you're saying? Right.
Absolutely, it's like your emotional bank. You will not be able to remove unless and until you have deposited something in. We are so busy in our daily work and daily pursuits that we never ever think about building our mental capacities, and that's where the problem comes in.
That's a very, very good point. Alok, what's your sense of this? I mean, you're coming at it from a different field, a different body of knowledge. Is there, in fact, things that we can do as very regular people to develop our own, say, mental habits, like Ashi spoke about happiness habits, or maybe they happen habits of resilience, or whatever else will help us through stressful, uncertain times? Are there habits like that?
Sure, of course. And the thing about narrative is that you know it's not that there has to be one narrative. Uh, there can, will, and should be multiple narratives, and the narratives will necessarily have to speak to each other. So, looking at it like this, that everybody is experiencing what we call anxiety symptoms, And so therefore everybody is experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, or labeling it, in a sense, is doing, to my mind, as much disservice to the situation.
It's a very
because
interesting point of view, Vasim. It's a very
because
unusual one, let me also say that.
because you know the fact is that distress is large, difficulty is large, coping is difficult. The fact that we need to find our ways out of this is very clear. This is true for people who have pre-existing, let us say, mental health challenges, but it is equally true of pretty much all of us, of society. So in that sense, the 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 business about labeling, uh, and this is where all those issues about labeling and diagnosis making, and the fact that the fact that it serves a purpose, the fact that it has a disadvantage, the fact that it is comes with both edges of the sword, uh, is never more clear than it is today, because the fact of the distress is very clear. The fact that we have to figure out ways to deal with that distress in both big and small ways is very clear. The fact that individual attempts at resolution, and the fact that a collective attempt at resolution has to happen, and the fact that these need to complement each other. Very often when we state a point of view, quite naturally we tend to overstate that point of view. So the fact that this is a societal crisis and a disaster, that this is a humanitarian crisis and disaster, the fact that this is a disaster of equity, of justice, we are very clear. Does this mean that I don't take care of myself? Of course not. In a sense, unless I am able to take care of myself, the likelihood that I will be able to do all the other things becomes impossible. So in a sense, this might almost seem as if we are making the burden on the individual soul आज कि अपना भी ख्याल रखो, अपने परिवार का भी ख्याल रखो, अपनी आमदनी का भी ख्याल रखो, अपनी कॉलोनी का भी ख्याल रखो, अपने देश का भी ख्याल रखो, अपने समाज का भी ख्याल रखो, और दुनिया का भी ख्याल रखो. And yes, this is exactly what we are saying. The fact is that if our thinking does not, in a sense, work towards harmonizing these levels in those skins of the onion peel, as it were, the fault lines will be so much more obvious, so much more clear, so much more damaging. And in a sense, that is what we are seeing. In a sense, we've been saying this, I've been saying this, that the pandemic is a time when all those fault lines become deeper, wider, broader. Uh, and I've forgotten the number of times that I've said this. But in a sense, uh, this is as much the chicken as it is the egg. The reason that the pandemic is so devastating is that those fault lines are so very large to begin with. So the question is, where do I even begin? I mean, is it then, is the onus on me to figure out the solution to social inequity and the lack of justice and the inhumanity that we are witnessing? And the answer is yes and no, of course. Of course it is, and of course all of it doesn't rest only on my shoulders. But if I was to start with myself and end with myself, I'm not getting anywhere. I'm not getting anywhere in a big hurry. If I'm to start with myself and take care of myself and do it in a way that I keep in mind the larger goal, then perhaps not only will I, but my neighbor and my friends and my community and the people who work for me and the people who work with me and the people who I read about in the newspapers and the people whose lives don't seemingly touch me, but obviously do. So if I look after myself, being aware of the fact that we are one, then maybe maybe those are the lessons that, and that's why it's an inflection point. If we are going to retreat into our small worlds of privilege, then we will have learned nothing.
I think this is such an interesting perspective, Alok, that it isn't about the individual alone. And like Ashish spoke a lot about the habits that will build strength, and that's a wonderful starting point for being able to look after oneself. And as they say, wear the oxygen mask yourself before you help anybody else. But what you're also adding to that perspective is that that's a start, but for us to be able to learn lessons and perhaps heal in a deeper way, it is the interconnectedness between us and people we both know and we don't know that needs to come together with some lessons learned, maybe some resolutions of things that will be different for real healing to happen across. I'm going to take a few questions and comments. Zara, good morning. Dr. Shalini from UK. Hi, Zara. Hi, Pramod. Lots of hellos. Papia says, I like your acknowledgement of mental health and economics pandemic. Vijay, good to be here. Keen to listen specifically how regenerative and resilient leadership could be a much needed trait of future organizations. So actually for this, let me start with you, Ashish, since you work a lot with organizations. And one of the conversations we've had even on the Future of Work show here is that we're entering an era of great uncertainty. And what we've experienced in the pandemic is, of course, it's an event that I hope we don't experience too many times with this level of intensity. But the one thing we know for sure we will be experiencing with a ever increasing intensity is just change and uncertainty all around us. And therefore, there's been this whole conversation on leaders needing deeper reservoirs of resilience. So, where does that resilience, where is it supposed to come from?
In fact, we have been hearing about this VUCA world for a long period of time, Dr.
Yeah,
Shalini.
decade at least. Yeah,
Decades we are listening, and I think it's nothing new in terms of businesses facing uncertainty. But as you rightly mentioned, the enormity with which we faced uncertainty this time was unprecedented. I think nobody could imagine that somebody like us would be going through such trauma as far as business is concerned. But what Martin Seligman says that human beings are wired to be resilient, right? And we are the most adaptable creature in this world. Nothing can break us unless and until we let things break us up, right? So for me, the genesis of resilience comes right from the childhood experiences and the way it has been shaped by people around you. For me, playing a game with my son can be a good way to teach him resilience, because say for example we were trying to put the cards, we were trying to build a palace of cards and the cards was breaking all the time, and there were two choices. Either one choice is that I give up and say that this is not my cup of tea, and the second is let's celebrate small wins. Although the first rack is done, let's build on the second one. It will break down, but we will build the third one and then build our lessons from there. I don't need to teach that person that this is resilience, but somewhere the person has learned that it's not okay to give in between till the time you have finished something. So I think the role models which we have, the life experiences which we have, and the way we deal with uncertainties in our personal life also shapes the way our mind is wired towards looking at difficulties like this. And you would love seeing or hearing stories of people showing a lot of resilience, right? The heroes are built around resilient behavior, because if you are a human being, problems are supposed to come to you. It's not about the problems, it's about how we are dealing with that problem defines our resilience to that particular situation or not. So for me, any business leader who has gone through the highs and lows of running a business right from the beginning, like as an individual contributor to being a manager to being a super leader, and if that person has experienced a lot of setbacks, how that person was coached at that point of time, how that person has experienced being surrounded with difficulties and then still coming out of it, will define what type of leaders trait he displays at the time of pandemic like this. One thing I would like to add, Dr. Shalini, on your platform, in fact, two things. One, nobody can take responsibility of your character and your happiness unless until you decide to take responsibility of your own happiness and character. Nothing will move. As Dr. Alok Sarin was saying, that we also need to keep the larger world in mind, but unfortunately a lot of us don't even take care of ourselves. And when you start trying to make the world a better place without taking care of yourself, it does not sustain for a long period of time. So for me, the biggest message which I am giving to a lot of corporates right now and to employees specifically, don't expect your employers to engage you. Don't expect your employers to make you happy. Take happiness in your hand. It's your accountability. You are solely responsible. Organization can help you, right? Organization can create right environment for you. But if you are not serious about your own happiness, nothing can make you work. And the second thing is, we as an organization, as an employer, need to bring a lot of empathy in the way we deal with everyone. Empathy training should be mandatory in all the organization, and I'm also not talking from only from a business perspective, but also a very important aspect of how do you deal with people who are going through grief right now. Okay, I have seen a lot of people, even in my close friends, somebody died, and I did not know what to say, what will comfort the person. And so, for example, if somebody who is having a lot of grief coming to work, and you have got multiple discussions going on how to talk to this person, what should say, what should not say, becomes very awkward for the person who is feeling the grief. and also for the person who is not part of the team but does not know how to react with it. So bringing a collective empathy mechanism is something which will be very critical for all of us going forward. And that empathy, when as a leader you display that you have to take care of everybody, even the last person in the company needs to be taken care of. The responsibility and action is now then driven by the collective wellness rather than by the individual survival instinct, which a lot of leaders display at most of the time. So I think that's the difference it will come
Yes.
in the.
Yeah. So I'm just going to like summarize your answer in response to the question. So when you said resilient leadership, the first thing you said was, it's a lot of experiences with failure at different points, and maybe you gave the example of from childhood. But to build resilient leaders, you need experiences with challenging times, and you need experiences with maybe failure, things not working out, and that's one part of the process. And the other part which you spoke about was the importance of empathy. And actually, what you spoke about grief, that's a really important issue. And actually, Dr. Alok Sarin, I'm going to ask you that next. That how do we help someone who's experiencing the loss of a loved one? Most people are pretty awkward around it because we really have no clue that, like Ashish said, what is it that we're supposed to say, what's the right thing, what is the wrong thing. So is there something like a set of guidelines on when a co-worker, for instance, loses a loved one, and is what is the best way to be of help? You're on mute, Alok.
Yeah, sorry. Uh, so grief and grieving in these times is multi-hued, multi-dimensional, complicated. Like this friend of mine speaks about. It's like a planet in mourning. May not be true of the whole planet, but very large parts. And grief is very often complicated. The simple narrative of grief, of let us say somebody who's 92 and who has lived what we call a full life, and at the end of it, surrounded by you know friends and family, passes away peacefully, is the let us say hoped for narrative.
Yeah.
The narrative of somebody who dies gasping for breath because we couldn't uh, organize the oxygen cylinder. Somebody who dies in completely isolated in the COVID world, where if you're intact, you will be speaking to your if you're mentally intact, you will be speaking to your friends and family on your phone. If you don't have a phone, or if you're not mentally intact, or if you don't have a signal at that point of time, or if your phone is run out of charge, and you're completely alone, the nurses are there. They will come. They will help you, but it's a variable thing. The nurses are also exhausted, depleted. So grief is complicated. Grief is complicated with many feelings. I mean, to the survivor, to the caregiver, uh, to the son or daughter or partner who is left behind, or parent or child. It's complicated by loss. It's complicated by bereavement, by resentment, by frustration, by helplessness, by a multitude of factors. And the more complicated grief is, the more we know that the longer it will last and the more difficult it is to resolve. So Is there a quick uh, 3-point um, model that exists as to how to deal with grief? And obviously there is not. But is there a core to this? And yes, there is. And that is the core of all therapy, which is compassionate listening, which is, in a sense, bearing witness. We worked a lot on the partition of India in 1947, and a very important concept at that point of time. And there's a very nice book which my friend Sukeshi Kamra has written, which is called Bearing Witness. Uh, which is which is the essence of all therapy. The therapist is not going to solve my problem for me. The therapist cannot solve my problem for me. The therapist is not going to render my loss uh, absent. The therapist is not going to restore my parent or my child or my sibling to me. The therapist will listen. The therapist will share. The therapist will, in that sense, make my individual grief in that small space collective, will allow me an expression. Coming back to what Ashish says, our abilities to resolve are very large, and the therapist will walk with me, allowing me to heal, helping me to heal, not healing me. The therapist cannot heal me. The therapist is not a guru or a god man. And we can say a lot about gurus and godmen, but we will leave that for another time. But the therapist, or what society needs, is to be able to bear witness, to listen compassionately. So if I can respectfully listen to my colleague's story, then I honor that story. I make that grief just a little bit less. And remember that in today's world, we're all grieving. And very often, to deal with our griefs, we need to be able to step out of ourselves. We need to be able to listen to the other person. We need to do what we can. In a sense, that resolution is that help is bi-directional. If I help somebody else get an oxygen cylinder, or if I share my preciously guarded oxygen concentrator with 6 people, I, of course, help them, but I help myself.
Beautifully said, Alok.
Sorry?
I said beautifully said. It's,
Thank you. Yeah. So unless I do things for the larger world, I can't. I'm part of the larger world. So doing what I need to do for myself includes what I need to do for the larger world.
It's very beautifully said. I love the thing of, like what Ashish said, right? That when people are awkward, they don't know what is the role that they should be playing. can you really be of help when someone's going through something that big as the loss of a loved one? And so people are awkward, they're not sure. And I think the guidance of all you can really do is bear witness and be there as a compassionate listener. That's all you can do for them uh, when they're going through. No? Okay, correct me.
It's not all that you can do. It's very large. It's not easy. It takes a lot of myself. It takes I need to make myself available. It is not something, when I say all I can do, that's all I can do. I diminish it. I don't
Taken,
need to
point taken.
diminish
Yeah.
it. I
Absolutely.
need to I need to respect it. I need to hear those stories. I need to tell those stories. I need to respect those stories. And in this meaning making, in this archiving, in this chronicling, this is what society does. This is what society is about. That we we listen to each other's stories, we tell them to each other, we interpret them, we take them forward, and that's a very, very large thing that we do.
No, point absolutely taken. It requires us to be able to give of ourselves by being there for all of this, and uh,
Yes,
that's that's how we can help. And I'll layer that with the other thing that you said, that by being there for others this way, and the other material resources that you spoke about, that is as much for them as it is for us in our own healing process. So I realize we're almost on the hour. Let me quickly check and see if there's anything we haven't spoken about. Mala says, never a formula for the right response to grief. An ex colleague of mine lost her mother, and I remember making no standard response. I did manage to convey how bad I felt for her. Well said, Mala. That's exactly what we were speaking about. Um, an important point is made by by Dr. Alok regarding collective effort. Yes, it's not going to be an individual effort. We as a society need to come forward. In continuation, Mala says, one of the things I did convey was that I was one person she could call up to talk to anytime, even if it's an unearthly. So by being there, by making yourself available. Okay, I realize we're at the hour. So any last message, you know, uh, something that people can take away with for themselves? Ashish, you'd like to go first?
Sure. I think as Dr. Sarin was talking about this being an inflection point, and I completely agree with this. And there have been people who are making a lot of change. Now, surprisingly, I also see a lot of positive news coming out of people who have gone out of their way to help. And one of the things I would always say, if I have to bring the crux of my studies on happiness, if you keep seeking happiness for yourself, maybe you may not find happiness. But if you seek happiness for somebody else around you, happiness is definitely going to come to you. So I think that's the point I will make, that if in a day, if you promise to yourself that at least one person will be happier because you existed, will be a great start from my perspective.
Thanks, Ashish. Make sure you have a role to play in making others happy for your own happiness.
Absolutely.
Alok?
yeah, I think so. I've pretty much said what I think. I would agree completely with what Ashish says. The the question of worrying about the larger, or thinking about the larger collective, is in a sense the ultimate selfishness. You know, altruism is the ultimate selfishness, because it that's what it's the pandemic, which is it has taken a global pandemic to remind us of the fact of that interconnectedness. Uh, and and that is why this is that potential uh, inflection point. We need to figure out what it is that we're going to take away from here. So
Thank
thank
you.
you very much, Shalini, for this. Thank you, Ashish.
Thank you so much. In fact, for all those who joined us today, I think what we heard today was a little bit different from, I think, a lot of the conversations that have been around us on managing anxiety. What was different was, Dr. Alok's point that it is about interconnection, it's about meaning making, it's about coming together and finding our oneness. That's a really important part of the healing process. And Ashish spoke about the importance of building resilience habits and happiness habits across all times in your life, so that when you are faced with a pandemic, you still find something within you that will allow you to do the kinds of things that Alok just spoke about. So very different ideas, I would say, which were discussed in today's conversation. I hope you find them useful. If you do, then do share them with others who might benefit. And if any of you want to catch up on part one of the conversation, just go to Uncube's website, and all our previous Future of Work shows are listed there. And have a great weekend for everyone, and we'll see you next time on the Future of Work show. Bye for now.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.